My Govanen, and welcome back to Medieval Art. I'm Dr. Brian Keane, and here again with me is Dave Lewis of Cinemallennials. Dave, in this week's episode, which was titled Udûn, we witnessed the first cinematic battle of the Second Age in the Rings of Power. And as we know, the very title itself can mean many things, from the Quenya Elvish word for hell, which felt very appropriate. It's also a reference to one of Sauron's former palaces in the northernmost part of Middle-earth, that is Utumno, and also a generic reference to a valley in Mordor, where we've been spending some time. So with so much on-screen violence between this battle of good and evil, Dave, what stood out to you in terms of lore and how the showrunners are developing Tolkien's Legendarium?
I think one of the best things about this episode was the dialectic between Adar and Galadriel about Uruks and orcs being a creation of Eru or a sub-creation of Morgoth. Are they redeemable? Do they have this idea of Theia and Hroa that Tolkien develops within discussing and thinking about his cosmological ideas? Can they be redeemed? Are they pure evil, or are they machinations of Morgoth and his sub-creation of Eru? Is he able to actually physically create, as Tolkien kind of says at the beginning, where Galadriel kind of talks about their twistings, their manipulations of the original elves, of the very first elves that were awakened, that were abducted, as it says in the Silmarillion? Or are they these people that are ultimately their original creation that were twisted and were thought of to be redeemable in the end? Are they able to go to the halls of Mandos? Are they able to be redeemed through men, and how they are able to eventually die? Is that kind of something that we're getting here? The dialectic between them, the touching of the darkness that Adar says. He says, "I'm glad I'm not the only elf in this world, in Arda, in Ea, that is being affected by the darkness, and it leading me down to things that are talking about eradication of a certain species, of a race." And it's also talking about the long defeat. Are we getting this idea that Galadriel talks about in Lothlorien in the book, The Fellowship of the Ring, that we're just prolonging the eventual defeat, the eventual fading out of the elves in this kind of imprisonment of immortality? And we're also getting a great reference to Yavanna and her subcreation, and how it was corrupted mechanically by Sauron to achieve the destruction that you can see behind Brian.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the various points you bring up, that we're seeing this long defeat between the battle of good and evil. And I like the point that you mentioned just minutes ago about the power of light over darkness, and this ability to still be touched by darkness, even if one is of the light, if one is, from Valinor and can remember the light of the two trees, as Galadriel says. But what we're seeing with Adar's character, I think, is a really beautiful step between the Uruk that we're used to seeing in Peter Jackson's films that seem so corrupted. There's this real sort of darkness and ugliness and brutality to the way they've been cast in this later series. But to see Adar as someone who still remembers what the warmth of sunlight is like on his face and wishes that for his orc brothers and sisters. I love that reference, even in his dialogue as he speaks out to the orcs. And he's claiming Uruk as the title, it seems, of pride. And so even in this, we've talked before about the racial tensions in Tolkien's Middle-earth, which is something that we knew very much as part of his own writings. And it feels all the more relevant today when we start to see men fighting men at the beginning of the battle for the Southlands, that they think they're fighting orcs, and of course they are, but they're also men among that group. And so we see this question of ethics in these great battles, and as you rightly say, the eradication, or even as some are calling, the genocide of the orcs, and Galadriel's sort of genocidal tendencies. But I wonder if we could touch on the point about Yavanna. I love that there was a very subtle reference by Arondir to one of the Valar who governs living and growing things. That's the subtlety of the series that I think is so beautiful, that it of course, for mega fans, is something that we relish in. And for those who aren't yet familiar, I hope it's the enticing detail that pulls you further into Middle-earth. So say more to us a little bit about Yavanna, her creation and the corruption, and her relationship to Eru and the other Valar.
Right. So Yavanna is this beautiful character throughout Tolkien's Legendarium, especially the Silmarillion, where she creates the green grass of the earth. She creates all the greenery of the earth. She is part of the creation of Telperion and The two trees, the two
Laurelin.
trees. She's the
Mhm.
part, Laurelin. That's the one I always have trouble saying. That's
Right.
why I didn't remember it as well. But she creates these things, these beautiful things, but yet they are constantly being corrupted by Morgoth and Sauron. And she has this idea. She actually goes to Manwë, who is the king of the Valar, and says, why must this keep happening? Why must this keep happening? Which is it leads to the creation of the Ents, the shepherds of the trees. So talking about this idea of protection, talking about this idea of, the green grasses, everybody talks about Middle Earth and how the earth is so revered by the elves, by everybody else, but there's constantly a threat there, and that threat does need to be protected, and that is by Yavanna and the Ents, and we even get a glimpse of the Ents there. So we're getting these things. I completely agree with you. We're getting these references. We're getting these outward things that Tolkien himself never really mentions within the stories. Like, he talks about them slightly. So it's very true to his actual writing without actually saying, Yavanna is helping us here. Eru is the one that turned the tide with the War of the Ring, the eucatastrophe that Tolkien came up with. This idea of the sudden hope of the sudden change from from ultimate death to ultimate life to ultimate hope being there in the end.
I think in thinking about the end, there was that wonderful soundtrack that culminates this episode as we're in a moment of reverence, and Bear McCreary's song Nolwa Mahtar, or Brave Warrior, comes on. And this was one of these songs that I think speaks to that point about the great spirituality that we've been developing. And to your point about the whole sort of pantheon of the Valar, I felt this kind of choral unison that reminds me of the Ainu Lindale, but also if it's singing out to a great warrior, there's this sort of real medieval vibe of a requiem coming about here. I mean, I could listen to this on repeat, as I said before. The lines, Telyatami nomme, finish them in this place. It seems almost an invocation against the darkness. And then following with Metyasina naikele, end this great or sharp pain. I valimar lumbule roi takale. O Valimar, another plea to the Valar and of the place of Valinor itself. In the deepest shadow, pursue the light, or find the light, as we've heard throughout this series. I know you've had some thoughts about what this song is referring to as well. Maybe you could share some of those insights here for our listeners.
Yeah, there's a couple things, talking about the Valar and how important they are to these people. We don't, reading the Legendarium, you get it more in the Silmarillion. You don't really get it in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. You don't really get this, but to have it be like this, one of the things that really brought to my mind was Tulkas. And Tulkas is the Valar of, basically, he's very protective of the elves. He hunts down a lot of he rescues a lot of these elves that are being corrupted by Morgoth and Sauron. He is the ultimate protector. He revels in fighting. He revels in the chase. He has this great kind of impatience in a way as well, that we're getting a parallel possibly to Galadriel and how she wants to keep pushing, keep fighting, and she doesn't know how to stop fighting. So I think that was a really great kind of nod to another one of the Valar that we're getting within this show.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, with Tulkas and Orome, another one of the Valar, we see this sort of constant pursuit from the north to the south. And I think we are seeing that twinning between Galadriel and Halbrand, their own movement across the north and the south to seek out evil. So this is a way, I think, that the showrunners are creating a beautiful adaptation or rendition or version of Middle-earth. And I hope that in one of our future episodes, we'll discuss even greater this concept of adaptation. So in our final moments, what are we looking forward to in the final episodes to come?
The eventual reveal of who Sauron actually is, if we've seen Sauron. If we haven't seen Sauron, I personally believe that we have not seen Sauron. There will be a great reveal of who Anatar is, the person that's the puppet master behind the Songs of Hithaeglir. And I think just overall how we're going to get more and more of the expression of who Galadriel is and who is she going to eventually change into as the person that we know, as we know her as.
Well, we have 2 episodes left and we're excited to have more conversations. Until then, Namarie.
Namarie.